Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone, depending on where you're joining us. And welcome to our webinar talking about the Internet Security Report for the end of last year, Q4 2021. And just to give a general overview, I think it was Heracles, an old Greek philosopher, I think he was even pre-Socrates, who said life is change. He had this concept, this Latin concept of things are always in flux and always changing. And that is definitely true of the threat landscape. As defenders continue to find ways to block new threats, the bad guys continue to evolve too, which is why we do this report, to kind of keep our finger on the pulse of what's going on the threat landscape, to see what quantitatively our devices and our products are finding online, what we're blocking and what we're preventing from entering your network. Because if we can learn the general trends of what these bad guys are doing, we can definitely react to that change. And change, a lot of people are scared of change, but if you're prepared for it, if you know it's coming, change isn't bad. Being able to adapt to change, and that goes for adjusting your security defenses, is one of the best ways to get through life, which will have constant change. And definitely as a security professional, reacting to the change in the threat environment is one of the ways you can protect yourself, which is why we have this report every quarter. Before we start, let me introduce myself. I haven't said my name yet. I'm Corey Nachreiner. I'm now the Chief Security Officer at WatchGuard Technologies, was once the Chief Technology Officer. I do both those duties now, but among my roles, one of my favorite parts of my role is managing the WatchGuard Threat Lab, which is a team of analysts. You'll meet one of the top ones today. And we basically, as I mentioned, keep our finger on the pulse of the underground, the threat landscape, to see what's going on. Besides, of course, running the Threat Lab, I do, of course, head up corporate security here at WatchGuard, among other things. But with that, let me introduce you to my co-host, Trevor. Take it away.
Hi, as Corey said, Trevor Collins, security operations analyst. Like Corey, I've adapted from other positions and as now the security operations analyst, and been with WatchGuard for about 7 years, and I've worn many hats. Recently, or for a while actually, I've been organizing the data for the quarterly reports that we put out, and in general, just keeping WatchGuard secure. Also doing a lot of stuff on the dark web, and so it's been a lot of fun projects as well.
Yeah, one of the top analysts here, and he helps with our corporate security now that I have the CSO role, and has done a lot of scripting and work on our SIM. So thanks, Trevor. And by the way, the report's written by many others besides us. So you're probably used to Mark LaLiberty being on this call as well. He's kind of the SOC manager and the lead of the WatchGuard Threat Lab. Works very closely with Trevor. But you can see a lot of other faces like John, Ryan, and Josh. All of them write sections of the report. Fantastic analysts. Ryan does a lot of malware research now and is part of our malware analyst team now that we acquired Panda Security. John and Josh both work very strongly with our DNS Watch team and cover a lot of the domain threat intelligence. So a big wealth of security research goes into this report. By the way, I should also shout out our great editors and marketing friends, Martha, who helps edit our report quite often, and Holly, who lays it out for us. We're good at the tech stuff, but if it wasn't for them, the report wouldn't look as pretty. Now that you've met the team, why don't we go ahead and cover the agenda really quick? If you've been on one of our internet security report calls, it's a pretty standard agenda. The report starts with something called the Firebox feed, which I'll define in a moment. But this is where we share a lot of quantifiable security intelligence from our main core network security product, the Firebox. So with its scanning services, we talk about the top and most widespread malware, which is Trevor. He'll cover that section in quite a bit of detail. Because of intrusion prevention, we talk about the top network attacks we see. And because of DNS Watch Go, which I'll cover in a sec, we cover all the bad domains we see users sometimes try to click on. As I mentioned before, WatchGuard over a year ago now acquired a company called Panda Security, and we have products like WatchGuard EPDR, So we have a lot of endpoint product data as well. So those products are sending us quantifiable threat intelligence. So we have a newish section, we've had it for a few quarters now, where we cover some of the really top level highlights of threats we see from endpoints. And that does differ a bit from networks. So I'll get to that when we talk about that section. Besides those two product-based, those are all about the quantifiable trends we're seeing out there. We tend to have another section that either covers a top security incident from the quarter or some sort of primary research, some security research we're doing. This quarter, we went with the incident log4shell. So you've all probably heard of the vulnerabilities, one big one in particular that affected log4j 2.0. We'll cover that a little bit. I won't cover it a ton on this call because the report goes in a lot of detail, but we'll talk about why that's such an important one. And the cool thing, if you didn't understand technically how the main exploit worked, the report covers it in quite a bit of detail, so it's quite interesting. That said, the point of this report isn't to scare you with trends. Rather, it's really what I introduced this whole concept to you with. It's the idea of tracking the changes, paying attention to what changes in the threat landscape so that we can adjust our security defenses to go with it. So throughout this report and at certain sections, we're going to share some security defenses or things that go with our findings every quarter, things you can do to help protect yourself. So really the main point of this is to think about protection based on what we've seen. So that is the agenda. Let's get right down to it, since this will go fast, I'm sure, and start with the Firebox feed. Again, the quantifiable trends from our network security product. So what is this Firebox feed? Well, this is just a marketing name for the threat intelligence that all our network security appliances send back to us. By the way, this is opt-in only. We don't get this data automatically. You do have to opt into it. If you haven't, you should definitely check the report. There's a place in the Firebox you can opt into sending extra detail home. Not only is this the security intelligence that we use, basically stuff your box is blocking, but this is also just product intelligence that the product management uses to kind of find bugs and to see usage and to help correct things. In either case, when we do this report, it's anonymized. We don't pay, we don't see or configure your internal network. We're not paying attention to who is sending this data. We just look at the threats from a high level. So you can rest assured that we're not actually, this is anonymized data. It's not going to leak any of your privacy. Heavily encourage you to do. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, go for it, Trevor.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there, but Corey, just wanted to add in because I'm in charge of gathering all the data that is being sent to us, and all of this information that we gather is we want to get the equivalent data from each category of business, whether you're a medical office or an industrial, office there. Every time that somebody sends us this information, it really helps us to get a more clear view to create a better report that will better represent the data that we see out on the internet. That then hopefully we can all be more prepared in the quarter to come.
That is definitely correct. Yeah, so we highly encourage you to send it. I think it not only is good for us for this report, but it's good for you guys because everything we learn about the top trends being used is stuff that's shared with product. So it just helps us improve our product overall. So if you can share it, it would be fantastic. We already have, as you'll see, I think it's well over 70,000 now devices reporting in, but that's still kind of a fraction of the ones out there. So while it's very statistically relevant data already, it's always good to see different trends. And by the way, there's a lot of security services that the Firebox uses, but in this report, we're primarily paying attention to the malware services. So things like gateway antivirus. This is a very good malware service for catching the malware noise on the internet, the most common stuff, but it's heavily signature based. And we'll talk later about signatures versus more proactive techniques like machine learning or behavioral analysis. APT blocker is another of our malware services that you can have on the Firebox if you have total security. An APT blocker is much better at catching very evasive malware. It's not relying on signatures. Malware can, nerds call it polymorphic malware. But bad guys have ways to pack encrypt threats to make the same Trojan look different, at least at a binary level, over and over again by repacking it. And sometimes that gets past signatures. So that's where APT blocker comes in. Malware can't hide its behaviors. If it's ransomware, it has to do its thing in order to be effective. And that type of behavior is something APT blocker can catch, regardless of how much they use evasion techniques. So those are a few of the anti-malware services we use. By the way, we used to report on our machine learning one, Intelligent AV, because that's all such small numbers. It's not on a report anymore, but it's good to know that's another very proactive service. On the network side of things, our network attack section is primarily based on our intrusion prevention service. And this, of course, is a service that catches network threats based on signatures. It's not just attacks against servers, though. It's things against clients and browsers, outgoing web traffic too. In fact, I would say a lot of the top threats are more client web browser-based threats. So we get stuff from intrusion prevention. And finally, DNS Watch, and technically DNS Watch Go 2, which is the mobile version. But DNS Watch on a Firebox is basically what we call a DNS firewall. We have a lot of threat intelligence on the top malicious domains out there, and there's different kinds. There's many different kinds, but we primarily track three. You'll see compromised websites, which are legitimate websites that have been exploited in some way to serve something bad. Phishing websites, which have pretty self-explanatory sites that are hosting some sort of phishing, and then just malicious malware distributing websites. So there can be websites that are distributing malware, as the name suggests, but they can also be botnet command and control. In either case, we have a ton of dynamic real-time threat intelligence for all those domains. And if you have DNS Watch enabled, if one of your users accidentally clicks those sites, we'll of course prevent them from getting to it. So we have trends based on the top click sites that we see from DNS Watch. So we'll cover all of this today, but for now, I'm going to hand it off to Trevor to take care of our malware section, and maybe I'll get to a few questions in the background. It's off to you, Trevor.
Thanks, Corey. So for the malware trends, we go ahead and we're right now looking at an overview of all the numbers. One thing that we did change, if you'll notice, is if you remember last quarter's Firebox reporting numbers, they weren't nearly as high as they are now. What we're doing now, because we noticed that not every Firebox is going to report on every quarter, we're taking a sliding scale of the last 4 quarters of reporting Fireboxes. So at this point on, from this point on, this is what we're going to do, just so that we have a better idea about how many Fireboxes are reporting over the course of the year, because we see that case of a Firebox just not having anything to report during the quarter, even though it is scanning and inspecting traffic. All the other numbers are just based on the quarter, though. So our basic malware, we have seen the highest level yet, over 13 million, as well as our evasive malware has increased significantly by a third to 10.7, 10.8 million. And so we also see that the increase in the AD with TLS, GAD, our gateway antivirus with TLS, and our APT blocker with TLS, they have also both increased. So the story here is that everything, at least for this quarter, has increased, and we're seeing some of the highest numbers yet. One thing new that you'll see here as well is that for those who inspected TLS, they saw 66.7% of detections over an encrypted connection. So if you have a Firebox that is scanning the encrypted connection, then you'll see almost 3 times as much traffic total, and as far as the detection, 3 times as many detections. So that also means that if you're not scanning for encrypted traffic, then you're going to miss 2/3 of the traffic as well. I think we cover that a little bit more later on as well. So that's just an overview of the malware trends. We can go on to the next slide. Oh, Corey, I think you're muted there. Or at least I don't hear you. Maybe it's...
Thank you. I was actually talking. You helped me. I was muting. I didn't want folks to hear me typing answers to their questions in the background. I'm going to take this one really quick before handing it back to Trevor. I do want to apologize. Our platform kind of didn't work with polling questions this morning. We were going to ask this polling question, though, and Trevor will probably get to why it's important when we get to in his presentation of the malware and maybe at our defense section together. But we were going to ask you basically, do you egress filter? And do you restrict and monitor not just incoming traffic in your firebox, but outbound traffic? If you want to pop up in chat and say whether you do or not, that's great. Unfortunately, we can't poll you. But this would have been a very interesting question to us. I would say I suspect under 50% probably egress filter. It feels like a lot of people allow all outbound traffic. They use firewalls to block internal traffic. And I'll save the thunder for a little later on why egress filtering is important. But Trevor will probably talk about it coming up soon. So apologize that we can't have the polling questions today, but let me go ahead and move it on to Trevor. Oops, I went one too far. There you go, Trevor.
All right. So like every quarter, we cover the top malware totals. This is just the raw numbers that we see as total threat families that come in. We add them up and just list off the top 10. For this quarter, we see an interesting one on the first one. It's essentially adware. The threat family is generic KD, which is essentially just a generic malware family. And because adware can help some people, the problem with this particular program, though, is that while it's meant to remove ads from your computer or websites and things like that, it can also add in additional third-party programs that people usually don't want, you know, a search bar in your browser, whatever, you know. And so it's potentially unwanted programs, and that's what we categorize it at. The one thing to keep in mind when you're reading through these malware families under the threat name column is that the families, it's just it's a big category of what the malware is involved in. So while we can have many different types of malware, many different packages of malware that fall into the same family, and they'll do something similar, but then also they'll do some things a little bit different. We did find two new malware families that hit the top 10 this quarter. One is the Androme. I think that's how you pronounce it. It's a botnet. And this is a particularly interesting botnet that we'll get into a little bit later. But this is the first time we saw this. We also saw the Trojan Zumzi. Again, not sure if that's how you pronounce it, but that's what we're going with. And that's a WIN code injection. And so those are two malware families that we cover. And also we'll see the Trojan Zumzi again later on. But feel free to review the list here. And I think we are ready for the next.
Yeah, and before I move to the next, though, let me do a couple questions, not exactly related with our top 10, but a few folks asked a little bit about the 0-day malware or the evasive malware number, how we calculate it. And basically, I answered in the chat too. But Gateway Antivirus, which this list is mostly based on Gateway Antivirus. That comes with any firebox that has basic security. So the Gateway Antivirus numbers, if you have basic security, your box is sharing that. And that is what we consider not evasive malware because signatures detect it. So to get the 0-day malware, That we calculate from boxes that have APT blocker, and it used to be also intelligent AV. And basically on those boxes that have both gateway antivirus and the more proactive malware stuff that comes with total security, so it's really only from boxes that have total security, we compare the ratio. But of course, this list is for the more the ones that everyone has with basic security. Sorry, Trevor, just wanted to take the opportunity to answer a question. But now I'll move you on to your widespread malware.
The top 5 encrypted malware. But yeah, so this particular section is for the encrypted malware, and we will, again, you'll see that the Trojan Zumzi we see on this list as well. So whether it's encrypted or not, you're going to see this malware. Although, again, one thing to consider is that sometimes they're not the same. The Trojan threat, the Trojan generic threat name that we see on the top of this list is a slightly different piece of malware than what we saw in the top of the list on the previous slide. So again, each one of these threats can have slightly different programs. This one I remember looking at, it was not a adware, it was another program, another piece of malware. So we'll cover also the Trojan Zumzi and the BZC PZQ Boxer Trojan that we are covering. It's going to be a little bit later on, and we covered actually both of these in detail on the quarterly report. So I definitely recommend, if you're interested in that, to read that a little bit further. So I think we're ready for next. So like I was saying, Zum Androme, that one was a particularly interesting piece of malware because while we a lot of times see other botnets will come and basically communicate over either their command and control connection, a lot of times based on HTTP, HTTPS protocols. And this one actually uses an old school method, which is over IRC. I'm sure a lot of us remember IRC, which allows you to chat back in the day, but now, and a lot of times in the past as well, though, it was used for botnets. Well, this again is using IRC, and so we're not, just because it's no longer a popular way for malware to communicate, we're still seeing that today. So we definitely want to keep everything blocked, everything including outbound traffic. And this is why it's important to scan the outbound traffic as well. And so this particular piece of malware arrived over a email attachment as a RAR file, which is a type of archived, and then opens up into executable. One note that I would like to mention on the Androme is while it still uses old school IRC, it is a botnet. There are, in some cases, depending on what server it's connected to, what the people in control decide to do, it can actually push ransomware to your device as well. So there's that. We go all the way from IRC to ransomware. So that's a wide range of time there. So the other malware that we looked at is the Nachreiner. And essentially what this is, well, first, it's a toolkit that comes with the Kali Linux OS. And if you're familiar with that, that's just a OS that is used for penetration, but also used for hacking and malware creation. And it can, essentially what this malware can do, what this toolkit does, it's a big list of PowerShell scripts that you can get into, and it has all sorts of different programs that you can run. They're just all sorts of different scripts, and you can create office documents with the DDE exploit attacks. And again, I'd recommend to take a look at it a little bit more on the quarterly report. So I think we're ready for the next slide. So now we're going to cover the 0 day. This is the percentage of devices that scan for 0 day, the detections from ATP blocker. And then we see how many devices are with the 0 day and how many devices are previous known malware from GAV. For all connections, we can see that 2/3 of it, 66% average, when you round up, is malware for 0 day, but even higher over an HTTPS connection. So for the devices that are scanning an HTTPS connection, it's 77.7%. So in either case, and we believe that most of the malware detections comes over a HTTPS connection, you're going to see most malware over the 0 day.
Yeah, and if I can pause here, by the way, Trevor, just to give more explanation. 0 day malware, I want to define this because in the security industry, we use 0 day a lot. And the original way we use 0 day was more about network or software exploits. So I want to make sure you know this is not to do with 0 day exploits. So when you hear 0 day, they're typically talking about a vulnerability in a software product that may be on the network that hasn't been patched by the vendor yet. So that is one way to talk about 0 day, but we specifically call this out as 0 day malware. And as you kind of heard from Trevor in my spiel before, this is more evasive malware. This is malware that's done something to get past get past signatures, such as packing encrypting. Or this is malware that might use something called living off the land attacks. It does some sort of evasive technique to get past our basic type of malware detection. In fact, the most common and legacy type of malware detection is the signature-based detection in GAV. And the reason we point this out is to show how important the advanced malware security service is. Total security, one gentleman was asking me a little bit about how security services come with our product. In order to get our proactive ones, Total Security comes with APT blocker and IAV. And while those still just detect malware like GAV, they're doing so in a much different way. They don't have to worry about ways to make your file look different because they're not just looking for file indicators. They're looking for actual behaviors when malware starts running on a computer that they're watching. They've used machine learning algorithms to figure out indicators, features in malware that a human wouldn't even realize. So much better. So we think this is a very relevant number because whether you're using our Firebox and you're just using basic security, you're missing almost 2/3 of malware if you don't have Total. But while this is using our statistics, we feel like this is an industry-wide thing. If you're using other security products and you're using mostly legacy products that use only signatures to catch things, you're probably missing stuff. So one big takeaway is to make sure to add defenses, whether they're WatchGuard's defenses or someone else's, that are more proactive, that are things like endpoint detection and response, which is more about watching the processes and memory usage on a computer real time. Sandboxing software, which is essentially what APT blocker is, a behavioral sandbox, and other things. Trevor also pointed out that not only do we see a lot of 0 day malware in general, but it seems to be the most sophisticated stuff. If you're a bad guy, you're going to use HTTPS because it's a good way to get past security. If you're not scanning HTTPS traffic, which by the way is a lot more work, you have to set up a decryption algorithm between you and your user in order to see that traffic. But that's why the bad guys are using HTTPS as a channel to push malware at you. As you can see, when they're actually using that encryption, it comes with even more evasive malware in general, with almost, getting close to 80 at 77.7%. I did want to use this also as an opportunity to verbally answer a question that someone asked. In order to catch this encrypted malware, you have to use some sort of HTTPS decryptor, and that comes free with every firebox. You don't even need to have an advanced basic or total security. You have this functionality on your firebox, but it takes setup. You have to set up our HTTPS application layer gateway, and basically, the person asked, doesn't this sort of decryption slow things down and cause problems? I'm paraphrasing a bit, but that was the question. And the truth is, yes, when you have a HTTPS decryption algorithm on your gateway, it has to decrypt and then re-encrypt all the encrypted traffic going through it. So it takes more resource. But according to third-party tests, we're very fast at it. And nowadays, 5 years ago, customers would complain it seemed to slow things down. Nowadays, if you get the right box for your amount of people, and we have really good numbers to show this, we are one of the fastest at decrypting this traffic. And in most cases, if you're doing it right, it shouldn't really slow down traffic too much. Usually we can do it much faster than your ISP's line speed. So while it does technically use more resource and slow things down, if you get the right box, it's fine. The other issue you can run into it, by the way, setting this up does take setting up certificates. You either need to do it the hard way, which I don't recommend, which is exporting a certificate from your Firebox that you upload to all your browsing clients. That's a pain in the butt. I do not recommend it. The better way is if you run like an Active Directory identity server, a Microsoft server, you can create a CA certificate for your domain and upload that to the Firebox. And then every user and device that's logging on with Active Directory and has that certificate will now be part of the chain of trust on the Firebox we use to decrypt. So that's the easier way to set it up. But their question is, doesn't it sometimes mess up traffic? Well, yes, HTTPS is getting kind of complicated. There's things like HTTP or certificate pinning, where they try to make sure only one certificate is the master CA certificate. There's situations where applications you can go into the browser and you go to dropbox.com and our decryption works great. But if you open the Dropbox application, there's no way for us to get a certificate in that, so it doesn't work. The good news, the main question also asks, are there any best practices? And the good news is we're trying to build those into our decryption proxy. We have a lot of default exceptions that you can turn on right away. We know like the common sites where things get a little wonky and they're automatically on the default exceptions list. So I think the best practice is basically look at those default exceptions and enable them. But it's well worth it in our opinion. As you can see, if you're not decrypting this traffic, you're missing a ton of malware. A lot of attacks are going over HTTPS specifically because they know they evade controls. So we do heavily recommend it. Sorry for taking up so much time, Trevor, but just wanted to answer those questions. But I will move you on to your region.
No worries. Good questions on that, actually. And definitely that we're seeing that every quarter, that almost 2/3 of the traffic is encrypted over the HTTPS. So on to the malware by the regions. It's just an overview. What we do is we take the fireboxes that are reporting, and then we average it out, so that if we have a bunch of fireboxes in the US and then we see a lot of malware, it's not just going to show up as everything in the US. So this is the average of what we see, what we would expect you to see in each region. So in America, the North and South America, and EMEA, which is the Europe and Africa, and then APAC, Asia, and Australia. America, 22%, EMEA, 48%, and APAC, 28, almost 29%. So EMEA, we still see most of the malware, and we don't really have a good explanation for why that is happening, why we see most malware in EMEA, whether it be due to the region or where we're discovering. Not really sure on that, but if you have any ideas, let me know.
For sure. And this is a good transition. I do think one thing interesting about this is we're going to get into network attacks now, which I will cover. And I just want you to take a look at this regionality, with EMEA accounting for almost half of the malware we see triggering. It's going to be quite different when we get to network attacks, which are interesting. Oops, I just messed up my screen. Let me go ahead and go next. So that is transitioning us to the next part of Firebox feed, which are network attacks. And this section is really driven mostly by our intrusion prevention service, which, as I mentioned, is a service that has signatures for well-known software exploits that pop up all the time, and we block them. So high level, you can see right away, we've been seeing more and more attacks. And if I rewind a little bit, Trevor mentioned that it was an all-time high for malware again. Between both GAV and APT blocker, malware rose over last quarter and over much of the year quite a bit. And it really is the same with network attacks too. We saw just under 5.7, it was 5.68 million network attacks on the boxes that we're following. And that is a 39% increase over the previous quarter, which was Q3. And this turns out to be a 3-year high for us. I wanted to mention both malware and network together because one of the reasons, we can't always, we see the trends of what malware they're using, but we can't tell why the trends happen unless we have additional data. But in general, I think part of the big pop in Q4 for both malware and network attacks, but especially for malware, isn't just because it's the holiday season. Remember, this is Q4 data, so there's a lot of Christmas, Thanksgiving, Black Friday, Cyber Monday, lots of shopping holidays. And whenever there's shopping holidays, phishing tends to go up. Bad guys use all the normal, legitimate coupon and sale emails that go out as a way to do extra malware or spammy, fishy emails as well. But another reason, maybe more so for malware, is I think people are returning back to the office. 2 years ago, when the pandemic started, we saw our malware statistics drop quite a bit. And that's not because there was less malware. That's because in the Firebox feed, by the way, we saw the Firebox feed malware statistics drop. And that's a network security device that's in front of an office. So obviously, we believe this has more to do with people working from home, at least tech workers. When you're working from home, you may not be behind the firebox. And by the way, our endpoint security products continue to see high levels of malware. And of course, the endpoint products are catching this at home too. So long story short, essentially, the big decrease in malware over the past 2 years is likely because more people just weren't browsing the web behind the firebox, so there was less stuff to detect. But I think part of the rise in Q4 is right around that time was when offices, at least tech ones, I know some of you are in offices in different industries that you probably never closed, but a lot of knowledge-based workers have still to this day not returned to the office. But that began to change a little at the end of last year, and of course has continued, even accelerating in March. So we expect these both network attacks and malware attacks to go up. But in any case, this quarter for network attacks is a 3-year high. And the 39% increase. It does translate to only 75 attacks per device. For those of watching the past quarters, this might seem a little low, even though IPS went up. And that has to do with what Trevor was talking about, the different way that we decided to monitor fireboxes reporting it. Before, we only counted fireboxes reporting in if they told us at least one security incident. Now we basically let all fireboxes report in, or we include all the fireboxes, even if they aren't reporting security incidents, which is why we're up to 76,000 fireboxes. But that big increase from around 40,000 to 76,000 is why the network attacks per device seems a little low. What you do have to realize is a small percentage of the, like maybe 10% of fireboxes account for most of the network attacks we see. Actually, that's a very interesting thing we tracked this quarter. In the report, we found that the top 1% of fireboxes account for 75% of the detections. Then when you go to the top 10% of fireboxes, that accounts for 92% of network attack detections. And that means 90% of fireboxes out there are the remaining 8%. That means there's some fireboxes on the internet that, for whatever reason, are being more targeted by these network attacks than other ones, which is kind of interesting. But anyways, network attacks up quite a bit. We're not going to cover network attacks in huge detail because we find that this top 10 tends to stay relatively static. This quarter, we did see 4 new attacks. So what you're looking at is the top 10 network attacks by volume, not by the most widespread, just by raw volume. The first thing, without going over each of these lines in detail, I will say our top network attacks really is focused on web-based stuff for the most part. For the past decade, I've said the web is the battleground. And what I mean by that is a lot of server attacks are web application attacks, and a lot of the even network exploits are web-based client exploits, meaning they're not necessarily targeting your web server, they're targeting web clients in the browsers they use. So classic things show up all the time, like random SQL injection. When you see like these SQL injection attempts with numbers, the one in the top spot and the last spot, they're usually generic detections that catch a number of SQL injection flaws, and we'll talk about one coming up soon. But almost every single one of these is a web-based exploit. So just talking about some of the new ones first, one of them is the first one you see, web remote file inclusion, which is talking about that's basically the Windows command line in System 32. This is actually a very old exploit against a Acunetics web scanner that ran on a Windows server. Old exploit from 2005. You can find it in exploit DB. Another common thing we see in our top 10 list is a lot of exploits trying to take advantage of really old flaws. What we generally, what our analysis shows there are a lot of these attacks are not like the manual threat actors really trying to attack you. These are more automated scans, whether it be pen testing software like Nessus, or whether it be a botnet that has something called a mass scan command. There's a lot of ways to just go to every IP on the internet and just use well-known exploits to see if that server is vulnerable to something old. And even though 90% of the time the servers these mass scans find are not, because these are pretty old flaws, even if they find 0.1%, that is a win for them. It takes them no effort to automate these mass scans. And that's why we see so much of the old stuff like that Acunetics in top spot number 4. Kind of the same for number 6 when we get down to the direct 2D memory corruption vulnerability. This is not quite as old. It's 2014 rather than 2005, but an old kind of Windows vulnerability that affected the browser that had to do with how direct 2D, basically vector graphics were parsed. You could create a site that had a specially crafted vector graphic that would cause a memory corruption that bad guys could take advantage of. So those are a couple examples of the new ones. Another interesting one was the Mozilla Firefox one. When we get to the endpoint report, we'll talk about browsers being exploited. But this was a flaw that affected both Firefox and what is the Thunder Mail, whatever the Mozilla Mail client is. Although it required scripting, which was typically not allowed by default in the Mail client. So primarily this targeted Firefox over the Mail client. But long story short, the top network attacks we see are always web flaws. If I were to have some takeaways, if you manage a web server, you definitely need to pay attention to OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Project, and make sure your web developers or your contractors developing your custom website know about web application attacks like cross-site scripting, SQL injection, cross-site request forgeries, all kinds of different ways to attack web applications, because that's what we see being used often. And meanwhile, if you have people browsing the internet with any web browser, make sure to have IPS enabled, because bad guys are always looking for vulnerabilities to exploit through the browser. If they can host a malicious site and trick your users to come to it, they can do a lot of bad stuff. Regionally, let's talk about the regions we see all this, and this is what I was alluding to that differs quite a bit from the malware attacks. You can see, by the way, this is weighted by fireboxes. So this isn't the raw numbers. What we do is we take all the hits, we look for how many fireboxes are in that region, and then we weight the numbers so that they make sense for how many fireboxes. But even with that, most of these network attacks seem to be affecting the Americas this quarter. Like Trevor said, we don't have any data to really tell us why that is this case. And what's also interesting, some of the attacks I told you about, including the first one, the Acunetics one, or not the Acunetics one, the Direct2D one, that one happened more in EMEA and happened a lot in Germany specifically. So we see some countrywide regionality here and there, but it's very interesting to me to see this quarter, the Americas had most of these network attacks. Usually EMEA is in the top 1 or 2 spot. So it's very unusual to see EMEA at only 10% and APAC at 29%. So just interesting that it's quite a different regional distribution for network attacks versus what we saw with malware. And running low on time, want to make sure to get the questions. So let's pop into DNS Watch. So as I mentioned, DNS Watch is our domain firewall. And I mentioned we actually track 3 types of sites. The compromised domains, which these are legitimate sites that have somehow been compromised to serve something bad. Malware domains, which can be command and control infrastructure or malware distributing sites, and phishing sites, which I think are self-explanatory. Starting with top domains, the ones you see on this list are the ones that we saw most people clicking on in Q4. I don't recommend you go to these because they're typically bad, but won't go over all of them. But to give you an example, the one in the number 3 spot, Granerx, however you pronounce that, that actually is a legitimate health and wellness website that is there to distribute pharmaceuticals for senior communities. So a very legitimate site, but it's maintained with WordPress. And basically, it probably had a WordPress flaw, but at some point, an attacker hijacked that WordPress site, and that allowed the attacker to basically add some compromised code to the site, so that if you visit the legitimate pharmaceutical site, you might actually have malware driven to you or some script forced to run on your computer. Now, right now, it does seem to be that site has been taken down and fixed. But nonetheless, we still keep it on our watch list until we confirm it. So just one example from the compromised domains. The next one, the malware domain lists, these are, again, command and control sites or ones distributing malware. One of the interesting ones lower on the list this quarter was skyprobar.info. This site has been seen hosting many droppers. Droppers are essentially the first stage of malware. They may not include the actual malware they're delivering, but it's an evasive way to give you a little staged bit of code that then goes and tries to download pieces of the rest of the malware. So this site has hosted droppers before. It's been linked to Emotet. You've probably heard of the Emotet botnet. It was one of the most prolific ones, started in 2014. I think about a year ago, the US law enforcement mentioned that they took down the Emotet botnet, but these botnets have been shared on the underground for a while, so it's not uncommon to see Emotet recover as it has now. So of course, skyprobar.info has at one time been, hosting some of the droppers that will load Emotet. A couple other interesting sites there is slowleaks.com and securesolve.com. Right now, those domains are down, which is good, but the reason they were on our list is they had ties to adult site redirections. And by the way, this isn't bad. Unless you had web blocker, we wouldn't block that. I mean, people go to adult sites all the time. But when you go to adult sites, the way they monetize is they redirect to all kinds of crap. And sometimes they use sleazy redirectors that pay them money. And at one time, these redirectors were also redirecting to some bad domains that included C2 servers for another well-known, basically the Gozi botnet or URSNF, however you pronounce URSNF. And your sniff was kind of a botnet banking Trojan that stole banking credentials and often would come as an Excel file in a zip. In any case, both those domains are down, but it kind of shows you how maybe sleazy but legitimate sites sometimes connect to malware. And I don't think I need to cover phishing in too much detail, but I'll mention one, Targito.com. That was hosting a pretty typical phishing campaign using eFax as the primary lure. So you might have seen eFax as a faxing service or a document service, and they send emails to tell users when they have stuff. So basically, a typical eFax email would tempt the user to go to a domain, a URL on that domain. And that is where they would phish the user for more detail. So just some examples of what we catch with DNS Watch. But with that, let's jump right into the defenses tips and go kind of quickly, and I'll leave those to Trevor.
Thanks, Corey. So we're going to go ahead and review just for the Firebox feed defensive tips. And one thing, this is just kind of what we have noticed over the quarter, and hopefully what we can do for the next quarter when it comes to blocking malware, blocking network attacks, and keeping our traffic safe from domains that are malicious or compromised. What we first found is that we want to restrict and monitor outbound traffic. This is especially important for the malware that we saw earlier, and it's on the Androme. That's what it was. And for that malware that connects over a botnet, we still need to inspect for that type of traffic, inspect for the IRC protocol, and block that, and so that it doesn't have communication. It can't connect back to its command and control center. So yeah, I'll let Corey take the next one.
Sorry, it took me a second to unmute myself. The next one is keep WordPress plugins updated. As you heard in the DNS section, one of the compromised sites was a WordPress site, but a lot of the attacks we see go after WordPress. And so nothing wrong with WordPress, by the way. They have vulnerabilities like other software, but they tend to fix them quickly. The problem is if you're hosting your own WordPress, you have two issues. One, you have to keep up with the WordPress updates. If WordPress themselves fix something, you have to update your WordPress install. However, more commonly, the plugins you install in WordPress, there's thousands of them. And those are the things that we see vulnerabilities in more often lately. And those are the things that a lot of WordPress admins forget about. They might update the platform itself, but they might forget one of the tens of plugins they've installed to make their pages prettier. And if there's a vulnerability in those, a lot of the time, bad guys exploit them at scale. They can easily scan and find a bunch of WordPress sites and then try that against all of them. So we'll talk about keeping everything up to date, but if you're a WordPress administrator, make sure that you really are keeping up with both WordPress's updates, but also the plugins that you've added that come from all kinds of vendors. Back to you, Trevor.
Okay, so the next defensive tip is you want to audit your office, your physical office security controls. And so as people are coming back into the office, and I'm sure a lot of people are back in the office already, we need to make sure that the controls that we have are going to keep ourselves secure in the physical realm. Because if people have access to the servers, physical access, as we know, pretty much it's all over. So this means keeping control of badges, having a clean desk policy, ensuring that the devices that are being brought in are going to be having a policy for bringing in your own devices. And that, as we know, doing like a merger or acquisitions and having somebody new in the office, the same idea is that as we walk in, I'm sure a lot of new people have joined WatchGuard. So as we walk into the office, we're going to see a lot of new faces. And we want to make sure that everybody who is there is authorized to be there.
Cool, and those are just some tips, and I'm going to speed up now because I know we're short on time, but I did also want to reference the report, by the way. Some of you have asked where you can get it. It's going to be published today, is I believe the published date, so it may not be up quite yet, but it should be up today. We can probably send it to you, a link to you in the email after we follow up with this, or you can find it on secplicity.org, the threat landscape section. But our top security report this quarter was Log4Shell, which is the fancy marketing name for the Log4j2 vulnerabilities that showed up in Q4 of last year. You probably know about this because this has been all over the press. If you don't know what Log4j2 is, it's basically one of the most popular and widely used logging libraries that you would add to any Java application. So if you have a web app that uses Java, Log4j is probably something that you have just as an added library in order for it to write log lines based on different events. So it's a very common thing. What's interesting about Log4j is it's sometimes something you have that you've never installed on your own. Like if you're a web developer and you set up a website with Java, you might set this up on your own. Or you might just download third-party software that this is open source. This is just included in the software and you may not know about it. You could have hardware network devices that use Log4j because they use Java and stuff like that. So long story short, I would recommend you check out the report to learn about this, but a huge vulnerability, a CVSS 10 out of 10 for Log4j4 came out that affected a lot of devices in Q4. In the report, we actually talk about what something called a JND lookup is, so that you'll understand this vulnerability more. And we go through exactly what this vulnerability was and how you could exploit it. So if you're interested in that level of detail, definitely check out our report to get that detail. I'm not going to cover it here, but otherwise, just know hopefully you've patched all your Log4j stuff, but it's a big vulnerability that was out there. I do want to really quickly, I know I'm almost a minute from being over, cover high-level trends we see from our endpoint. The first one is, at a high level, we detect how much malware comes through browser attacks, through Java attacks, through Microsoft Office attacks, Windows, Adobe, but also scripts, just plain old scripts, whether it be JavaScript, ActiveX, and so forth. And you heard in Trevor's section, there's a lot of Word malware, Word DDE flaws and Office documents and things like that. But from an endpoint standpoint, most malware, 86%, almost 87%, starts with a script. This is very interesting because if you don't have more proactive anti-malware detection, things that actually like EDR, that's paying attention to scripts, it could be PowerShell. It could be a PowerShell script starting on your computer, and PowerShell is sometimes perfectly legitimate. So you need more advanced software like EDR, endpoint detection and response, that comes with Pandas 8360 or WatchGuard EPDR to pay attention to scripts that run to decide if they're good or bad. The reason we think there's lots of scripts is because it's a living off the land technique. It's a good way for them to evade traditional defenses by using just stuff that's on your computer already. You already have a browser that can parse JavaScript. You already have PowerShell and ActiveX parsers on your computer just with what you have installed. So they don't have to put malware on your computer. They can run malicious scripts. So know that nowadays, a lot of malware starts with scripts. Going to skip the polling question for now, but it was to see what web browser you used. My guess is most of you use Chrome because right now, I think it's in the high 90s percentage. Most people out there use Chrome. Not many people are using IE anymore. But the reason we asked that is when we look at, now script-based malware is the top. Browser-based malware is one of the ones we still see a lot of though. Here is the distribution in Q4. You can see browser-based malware going down every quarter, but what's interesting is IE is still the most exploited browser out there, with Firefox as the second. Chrome, which I believe is the most popular browser out there, isn't exploited as much. We don't see as many attempts against it. I don't think that's because Chrome's more secure. It has vulnerabilities too, but I will say Chrome's update mechanism is very automated. It helps you get the patch quickly. So that's a really high level description of malware from our endpoint level. Because we're so low on time, I just want to quickly go through the final takeaways on this. Trevor, I'll just take them to be quick. One, egress filter. Trevor already told you this. Spend some time not just blocking incoming traffic, but using your firewall, your network device, to block your users from getting certain traffic out. I was happy to see a lot of you that, while we didn't have polling up, a few of you mentioned you are using egress filtering already. Some of you weren't, and a few of them were partial. The problem with egress filtering is when you turn it on, it's kind of a pain in the butt. You're going to turn it on, and of course you want your users to still browse the web and get email and get DNS. So you'll add policies for all the basic stuff, but right away you're going to learn a few things your users are doing on different ports that you didn't know about. Maybe you didn't realize that certain admins need SSH. Maybe you didn't realize that your marketing team is using some weird application that uses port 7051 or something. But so when you first turn on egress filtering, you're going to get users being blocked from things, which will start calls. But that's good and normal part of the process. As you find out what they're doing, if it's legitimate business stuff, you of course allow it. But you don't want to allow everything. Just allow what is important to the business. And by doing this, the benefit is if there's ever a botnet on your computer that uses a weird port, it's going to be blocked by default. If there's ever malware that calls home on a non-standard port, it's going to be blocked by default. Yes, the malware that does use standard ports like HTTP and others will still get out, but you have scanning services for that. So long story short, egress filter. Patching. You need to patch, whether it's WordPress or anything. In our network attacks, most of the vulnerabilities we see being exploited are really old. Just patching will fix that for you, although it's still great to have IPS blocking them. I know patching is something that is so easy for me to say, just do it as quick as possible. In reality, it's hard to do. Not because you don't know you should, or not even because you don't know what needs to be patched, but we have business circumstances where we have to deal with an old server because of uptime needs, or because a certain piece of software hasn't been made for the newer version of it. So, and the other issue with patching is, how do you treat hardware? A lot of people forget you have to patch your hardware too, or Internet of Things. Maybe your patch management and vulnerability management software isn't as good at detecting when hardware needs to patch. So I get that there's a lot more to patching than me just saying go patch. It takes some work, and there are issues that you run into in normal business. But that aside, do your best to try to test patches and deploy them as quick as possible. The final thing, and this tip is kind of independent of the trends we see this quarter, but it's to mention you should have a business continuity disaster recovery plan that is good. If you are comfortable that you can recover from ransomware, and the reason you'd be comfortable is you have a plan. You have this business continuity plan. If your servers go down, you know you have a tested backup you can restore quickly, or you know you can spin up a virtual machine in another part of the world. As long as you've created a really good business continuity disaster recovery plan, you can rest at night. You know, regardless, all the trends I'm talking about, we want you to be able to prevent the attacks from ever making it in. And 99% of the time, if you follow our defensive takeaways, you will block the attacks. But the truth is, you're never going to block everything. And the best thing a security professional can do is make sure that they can survive when they do have an attack that succeeds. Do your best to prevent by doing all the tips we did, but have this backup plan, and you know you can survive irregardless. So I know we're over time. You can definitely come to all our places to learn more about these attacks. Trevor might have to leave for another call he mentioned, but if for the folks willing to stay, I will see if I can answer any questions. One question I wanted to answer out loud is, one of our users asked, for geolocation, how can you reliably figure out geolocation? And I think you were alluding because the attacker can proxy. The attacker can can come from places that may not be where they really are. And the key to that is we're not geolocating the attacker. We're geolocating where the firebox is. So when you look at our geolocation, that is the who is being attacked location, not where the attacker is coming from. So it's showing where the attacks are going to. And that is based on the external firebox IP. We don't actually have the list of IPs. We just geolocate them using standard geolocation things for IPs. So the reason we think geolocation, it always has slight issues, but it's relatively accurate, is because it's not the view of where the attacker is. For the attacker, the IP you see attacking may not be the attacker at all. It could be a VPN or a proxy or something. We know that. So we're only looking at the victim. Another question. Go ahead, Trevor.
You're right. I do have to head out, but thank you for having me on the call, and thank you everyone for taking a listen to our quarterly report. I'll let Corey take it from here. Have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Trevor. And I'm just going to go through questions for another couple minutes until 9:10, and feel free to drop off. Your time's important. Nick had asked, you had mentioned APD blocker looks like behavioral not only at the firewall level, but further up when it gets to the machine. So APT blocker is run at the network level. What happens is when we get a file, we hash it, and we send it straight to our cloud to say, have you seen this file before? Yes or no? And if we have, we've already done the behavioral analysis, so we say it's good or bad right away. If we haven't, we do send that file to the cloud, and the cloud is how we detonate it. We run, it's basically full system full system code emulation. So we run the file in fake Windows, Linux environments, and we use a sandbox to detonate it and see the behaviors, and then we share that information back down with the firebox. Now, when we do have to send a file, it takes a little longer to get a response. If it's an email, we can still delay the email, and we still get a response in plenty of time and can strip it from the email if it's bad. If it's a web connection, by the way, the first person that goes to it will still get to it. And we share the response after and then block it from that point on. So it is network-based level, but yes, we're executing it on a machine. That's what the sandbox is. You said, how effective is it when you don't use TDR or the Panda endpoint? I think it's very effective, but not all not all malware goes through the network in a way that we scan. The network device can only scan malware if it's going through one of our proxies, and we only have proxies for some protocols. So the long story short is our endpoint products, whether it's TDR or whether it's AD360 or WatchGuard EPDR, I highly recommend you having endpoint malware too, because there's stuff that gets past the network just in the way it delivers. And we do behavioral checks on the endpoint too. It's a different kind of schema for how we do it through Pandas Cloud, but I would highly recommend that you do it on the endpoint too. So that's that question. Let's see if I can find a few more. Do I have a link to the article? I can, for the folk that asked if I had a link to how we do deep packet inspection for encrypted traffic like HTTPS, if you search our knowledge base, they're definitely there, but I don't have the article link on hand, but we can probably answer that sometime after the call via email. How can I ensure we're sharing the statistics on the Firebox? Check our report, because we tell you the exact option to turn on. I forget the exact instructions of where you do it, where you turn on this opt-in for data sharing. Trevor, who had to leave the call, would know it, but it's in our report right at the beginning. So check that. I might be able to provide the answer in email. If we are geofencing and block Russia, would these domains be blocked even without DNS Watch? Yes, I believe our geofencing functionality doesn't need DNS Watch. DNS Watch is to block specific domains based on something we've seen on the domain, whereas geofencing is the way to just put regions in. By the way, I'm mixed on geofencing full countries. I support Ukraine, by the way, so I have nothing against supporting Ukraine and kind of being against Russia. But the one issue with geofencing full countries is while there are some countries that have more than average malicious activity coming from that country's IP and domain space, unfortunately, a lot of legitimate businesses are in other countries too. So unless you're a government agency, it may be hard to block an entire country geo-region. You might find some users actually have legitimate purposes to get to some IPs there. But nonetheless, geofencing should work fine without DNS Watch. And because we're 12 minutes over on time, there's some other questions. We try to get to unanswered questions in email if we can. So apologize to the folks that I couldn't answer on the call, but we'll try to get back to you. Again, the report, you should be able to find it on Simplicity once we hit the publish button. I believe the slides, we can share them in the email after this, and you can watch the on-demand recording if you missed some too. Thank you all for your time today. I hope this was useful and you have fantastic days.